Leaned forward slightly, sensing the fragility in her words. I remember hearing about Esser, he said. They said it was an accident, structural collapse, mining operations. Sarah's mouth twisted, a bitter foreign expression. No accident, your people needed the minerals beneath our gardens, they crushed us from below. The fire snapped sharply as if in protest. Rodney stayed silent, letting her shape her own truth. They came after the quake, Sarah continued. Human soldiers, they said they would save us, but they took us instead. Her hand brushed unconsciously at the place where the collar had once chafed her neck. The gesture made Rodney's stomach clench with helpless anger. My mother was a scholar, she said, voice thinning to a whisper. She taught the old songs, the history of the Valari. She refused to kneel. They killed her for it. Rodney swallowed against the dryness in his throat. And you? He asked, though he already hated the answer he expected. I was given to the colony governors, sir said simply, a living token, proof of conquest. She said it without bitterness, only a kind of weary detachment that was somehow worse. Rodney ran a hand down his face, scrubbing at the grit and guilt building there. You deserve better, he said finally, a hell of a lot better. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him with that unblinking intensity. And you? She asked, what did they take from you? Rodney sat back, staring into the fire. For a long moment he hadn't spoken of it in years. Maybe he thought if he didn't give it words it would lose its weight. But it hadn't, not even a little. I grew up on Dresden, he said slowly, one of the early frontier colonies. My parents ran supply runs, small time, never had much. Sierra watched him, silent and still. When I was 14, the syndicate wars hit the outer colonies. Raiders came through, stripped the settlements for anything they could find, supplies, workers, tech. My family resisted. The flames reflected in his gray eyes, sharpening the lines of his face. They made an example of them, he said, burned our house to the ground with them inside, left me to watch. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He forced it still. After that I learned to survive, worked salvage crews, rescue teams, move supplies through war zones, saved who I could. Rodney's mouth curled into a grim line, but it never felt like enough. For a while they sat in silence, two broken paths tangled together in the dark. Then Sarah did something Rodney hadn't expected. She leaned forward, reaching across the flickering firelight, and laid her hand gently over his. Her skin was cool and trembling against his rough palm, but the touch was steady, deliberate. You saved me, she said again. This time it wasn't a statement of fact, it was an acknowledgement, a choice. Rodney squeezed her hand once, careful and sure. Not just you, he said, we save each other, that's how this works. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. The fire popped, sending a cascade of sparks up into the dark, starless sky beyond the cave walls. The desert shifted and whispered, a land too big and too wild to ever be owned. Inside the small circle of light they had carved from the darkness, two survivors sat side by side, sharing warmth and the first fragile threads of something stronger than fear. For the first time since Haver's reach, Rodney allowed himself to believe they might actually have a chance, not because he could outfight the hunters Axton would surely send, not because he could outrun the reach of the colony's laws, but because in that fire-lit silence, with Sir's hand curled in his own, he realized something far more powerful than rage or revenge. Hope. They still had it, and hope, Rodney knew better than anyone, was the hardest thing to kill. The morning cracked open, harsh and bright. Rodney was already awake, his senses sharp and restless, when he caught the first vibration through the stone floor. Subtle at first, just a hum beneath his palms, but growing rhythmic, deliberate. Engines. He rose silently, careful not to jostle Sir, who still slept curled tightly under the thermal tarp. Her breathing was steady now, calmer than it had been in days, and for a moment he hesitated. She deserved more time, a few more hours without fear, but time wasn't something they had anymore. Rodney crouched beside her and touched her shoulder, light but firm. She stirred immediately, violet eyes snapping open, alert, no panic now, just readiness. She had adapted to survival faster than anyone he'd ever seen. He gave a small nod and she pushed herself upright, folding the tarp swiftly, movements efficient and silent. The vibrations grew stronger, the sound of engines bounced off the stone walls in distorted echoes, closer than he'd hoped. Rodney stuffed what little gear they had into the emergency pack and slung it over his shoulder. His pistol was already strapped to his thigh, fully loaded. He glanced at Sarah, who tightened the fraying strap of her pendant around her neck and gave him a quick nod. They slipped from the mouth of the cave into the maze of crags and fissures beyond. The desert stretched out before them in brutal, unforgiving lines, all burnt reds and muted browns under the rising suns. Rodney chose a path that kept them low, weaving between rock pillars and broken ravines. Their boots kicked up little puffs of dust that the wind immediately shredded behind them. The rumble of pursuit grew louder. Rodney risked a glance over his shoulder. 3 bikes, light scouts, just as he'd feared, fast, maneuverable, designed for this kind of terrain dust plummeted behind them like angry tails. They had maybe 5 minutes if that. Rodney quickened his pace, motioning Sierra to follow. She moved without question, without hesitation. She trusted him now, and that knowledge settled heavily in his chest. He would not fail her. The rocks thinned ahead, breaking open into a shallow basin. Beyond it a ridge rose up, a narrow path leading to higher ground. If they could reach it, they might be able to lose their pursuers in the broken cliffs beyond, but the basin was exposed. Too much open ground, too many angles for a clean shot. Rodney slowed, thinking fast. He scanned the terrain, scattered boulders, a dry gully cutting across the near side. No perfect answers. We run fast, he said under his breath, glancing at Sarah. Stick close, no stopping. She nodded once, fierce and sure. Rodney's chest tightened with pride and fear. In equal measure they broke from cover together, sprinting across the open ground. The bikes roared in behind them. Engines howling, shouts rang out sharp and ugly, carried by the wind. Rodney didn't look back. He focused on the ridge, counting each step, measuring the distance in his head. Gunfire cracked the air, dust exploded near his feet. Another round winded past his ear. They weren't aiming to kill, not yet. They wanted them alive. That made them sloppy. Rodney veered toward the dry gully, hauling Sir with him. They dropped into the shallow depression just as another volley tore up the ground where they had been. He landed hard, the impact jarring his knees, but he kept moving, half dragging, half guiding Sierra through the twist of rocks. A bike engine roared overhead, too close. One of the hunters peeled off, circling low, trying to cut them off. Rodney yanked his pistol free, braced against the gully wall, and fired. The shot rang out sharp and brutal. The bike shuddered, veered, and crashed in a plume of dust and twisted metal. One down, but there were two more, and they were closing fast. Rodney gritted his teeth, helping Sarah scramble up the far side of the gully. She moved with desperate strength, her bare feet bloody but steady. They gained the ridge just as another bike skidded around the basin, rider leaning low, rifle raised. No cover, no time. Rodney shoved Sierra behind a jagged outcrop and turned, firing twice in quick succession. The first shot missed, the second hit the rider's arm, sending him spinning sideways. The bike toppled, crashing in a tangle of limbs and machinery. Rodney didn't stop to check if he was alive. He grabbed Sir's hand and ran. The final bike gunned its engine, howling after them. The ridge path narrowed, the rocks closing in, forcing them into a tight, twisting climb. Loose gravel skidded under their feet, every step a battle against gravity. Rodney could hear the last rider closing in, the engine snarl growing louder. The rattle of loose stones kicked up in his wake. At the crest of the ridge Rodney spotted salvation, a narrow ledge just wide enough for them to slip along, leading deeper into the cliffs. Sierra, go, he barked, pushing her forward. She didn't argue. She darted onto the ledge, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned long ago not to question survival. Rodney turned to face the last rider. The bike burst over the ridge in a spray of gravel, the rider leaning forward, a shock baton crackling in his hand. Rodney didn't wait. He fired once. Then again. The first shot clipped the bike's front tire. The second tore through the rear's thigh. The machine bucked wildly, throwing the men off. He hit the rocks hard and tumbled down the slope in a cloud of dust. Silence slammed down heavy and abrupt. Rodney stood there for a moment, chest heaving, pistol still raised. Then he turned and sprinted after Sierra. He caught up with her halfway along the ledge where she crouched against the wall, wide-eyed but unheard. You okay? He rasped. She nodded, her face pale but determined. He exhaled sharply, adrenaline crashing into exhaustion. They moved again, slipping deeper into the maze of cliffs until the sounds of the chase faded behind them. Hours later, as twilight deepened and the stars bled into the sky, they found another cave, a narrow slit in the rock. Invisible unless you were looking for it. They crawled inside, too tired for caution. Rodney collapsed against the wall, every muscle trembling with the effort of keeping going. Beside him Sarah sank to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest, the crystal pendant glinting faintly against her bruised skin. For a long time neither spoke. Finally Rodney broke the silence. You fought like hell back there, he said, voice rough. Sarah gave him a tired, crooked smile. You taught me, she said simply. Rodney let out a breath that was almost a laugh. In the battered ruins of a broken world they were building something new, slowly, painfully, stubbornly. Hope, stubborn and wild, refused to die, and tonight that was enough. The cave was colder than Rodney expected. The stone floor radiated the night's chill into their bones, and the thin air seemed to sap the warmth from the small fire they had built. Sarah huddled close, her arms wrapped around her knees, the flickering light casting long shivering shadows across her skin. Rodney sat opposite her, tuning the battered shortwave receiver he had pulled from the emergency pack. The thing was ancient salvage from a mining station years ago, but it still worked if you coaxed it right. Static hissed and popped through the small speaker. Sierra watched him, silent but curious, her green hair falling like a curtain around her face. Finally, after what felt like hours, a faint voice cut through the static. Rodney Vance last seen fleeing the colony perimeter considered armed and dangerous assistance in capture will be rewarded. Rodney killed the volume with a quick twist of the dial. For a long moment neither of them moved. They put a price on us, he said flatly, stuffing the receiver back into the pack. Figures Axton doesn't forgive public humiliation. Sarah's voice was soft but steady. They hunt you too now. Rodney gave a grim smile. They always did, just needed an excuse. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers shift and dance. The flames reflected in Sarah's wide eyes, turning them into small molten stars. We can't stay here long, he said. They'll sweep this whole region within a day or two, maybe less if they have drones. Sarah nodded, her expression tight. Where will we go? Rodney hesitated, tracing lines in the dust with the stick. There's an old evac station north of here, abandoned after the Syndicate wars. If we make it there we might find supplies, maybe even a working comms rig strong enough to reach the outer territories. Hope sparked faintly in her expression. Is there someone, she asked, someone who will help? Rodney leaned back against the stone wall, closing his eyes for a moment. Faces floated behind his lids, some dead, some scattered across the frontier, lost to time and war maybe, he said finally. Not many left, but a few still owe me favors. Sarah shifted, drawing her legs closer. You saved many, didn't you? Rodney barked, a soft humorless laugh. Not enough, never enough. Silence lapped at the edges of the firelight outside the cave. The desert wind moaned through the broken rocks like a wounded thing. Rodney opened his eyes and found Sierra watching him, not judging, just seeing him. You regret? She asked. Rodney stared into the fire for a long time before answering. I regret every damn life I couldn't save, he said, but not this, not helping you, not running. Her gaze softened. She unfolded her arms and leaned slightly closer to the fire, letting its meager warmth kiss her skin. You carry heavy burdens, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Rodney chuckled low in his chest. You too, Sarah. You just hide it better. She tilted her head, considering. Then without warning she reached into the folds of her worn clothing and pulled out something small, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth. She unfolded it with reverence, revealing a tiny delicate carving, an intricate symbol etched into pale blue stone. Rodney leaned in, studying it. It's beautiful, he said. What is it? Sarah brushed her fingers lightly over the carving. A mark of my family, she said. Valari tradition. Each line, each curve holds history, a map of who we are. Rodney swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. It's all I have left of them, she added, wrapping the carving back in the cloth with careful hands. Memory made solid. Rodney understood more than he wanted to. Memory's the only thing the bastards hadn't figured out how to steal yet. We'll keep it safe, he said. Both of us. She smiled, then small, fierce and real. It hit him harder than he expected. Before he could find words, a sharp noise shattered the moment. Boots crunching, gravel, voices low, muttered, too far away to make out the words, but close enough to snap every nerve tight. Rodney was on his feet, instantly motioning Sir to stay low. He killed the fire with a sweep of his boot, plunging the cave into cold darkness. He moved to the entrance, crouching low, peering through a narrow gap between the rocks. Figures moved against the starlit landscape, half a dozen at least, spreading out in a deliberate pattern. No bikes, no roaring engines. They were hunting on foot now. Silent, methodical. Rodney's pulse hammered against his ribs. They had tracked them faster than he expected. He slipped back to Sierra, his voice barely a breath against the stone. They're here, we move now, she nodded, already rising. Wrapping the cloth bundle and tucking it close to her heart, Rodney led the way, skirting the shadows, every step placed with ruthless precision. Sir followed, light and silent, her presence at his back a steady anchor. They slipped out of the cave's rear entrance, a narrow fissure that opened onto a steep descent. The rocks tore at Rodney's boots, sending pebbles skittering down the slope. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. Behind them voices rose, sharp, urgent. The hunters had found the cold fire pit. Rodney didn't look back. They reached the bottom of the slope and darted into the deeper ravines beyond, the landscape closing around them like a mouth ahead. The land split into two paths, one wider, easier to traverse, the other a narrow, treacherous ledge barely wide enough for one at a time. Rodney chose the ledge. Speed was no longer their ally, stealth was. They edged along the cliff face, the rock cold and rough against their palms. Below, the ravine yawned open, black and bottomless. Rodney moved first, testing each foothold, each handhold. Sierra followed, matching his movements with uncanny precision. Halfway across, a stone slipped under Rodney's boot, clattering down into the abyss. Shouts erupted behind them. Flashlights flared, slicing through the darkness. Move, Rodney barked, urgency sharpening his voice. Sarah didn't hesitate. She skewered along the ledge, nimble and fearless, her crystal pendant flashing like a shard of starlight. Rodney followed, heart pounding. Every instinct screaming, they reached the far side and bolted into the maze of rocks beyond, the shouts growing fainter. Behind them, when they finally collapsed behind a boulder, lungs heaving, Rodney realized they had bought themselves a few precious minutes, maybe more if luck held. Sierra leaned against him, trembling with exhaustion but still unbroken. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, grounding both of them. "We're not done yet," he said, breathless but fierce. "But we're still here." She lifted her head,